The blindfold smelled like burnt copper and something older, something that had no name in any human language. And the man wearing it was already beginning to suspect that the evening was not going to go the way the colonial administrator had promised. His name was Callum Voss, 31 years old, former Deep Space Survey tech, survivor of one hull breach and 2 administrative tribunals, current resident of the Threshold colony on Kepler 442b, which everyone called dust because of the red particulate that got into everything and stayed there forever, working itself into the creases of your hands and the lining of your lungs and the backs of your eyes until you looked slightly Martian yourself. He had not volunteered for the concordance ceremony. He had, in the way of most things that happened to Callum Voss, simply failed to refuse fast enough. "You are the most qualified," Administrator Prentice had told him 2 days prior, in that flat tone he used when he had already decided and was merely informing. "Your biometric profile is the closest match. Your neural resonance scores." "I don't know what that means." "It means the Vethkari chose you." Prentice folded his hands on the table. They were very clean hands, the hands of a man who had never touched the survey equipment himself. "The selection is their custom, not ours. The blindfold is symbolic. You won't be harmed." "You keep using that word, symbolic." "Because that's what it is." Callum had looked at him for a long moment. He'd been looking at people his whole life, reading the small tensions in their faces, the minute recalibrations behind their eyes, the way a jaw set differently when the truth had been subtracted from a sentence. It was something he'd always been able to do, even before the accident when he was 9 years old, the one that had taken a significant portion of his right hemisphere and replaced it with a subprocessor that hummed faintly when he was tired. The doctors had told his parents the surgery would change him. His parents had said, "Change him how?" And the doctors had paused in exactly the way that doctors paused when the honest answer was not something they wanted to give to the parents of a 9-year-old. He had been different after, yes. Less interested in the noise of other people's feelings, more interested in the shape of them. He'd grown up watching the world the way a naturalist watched birds, with great patience and no particular need to be part of the flock. His mother had cried about it occasionally when she thought he couldn't see. His father had told him once in the clumsy way fathers sometimes landed on the truth by accident. "You're still you. You're just more." He didn't know if his father was right. He still didn't know, standing in the center of the Vethkari Accord Hall with the copper-smelling blindfold pressing against his eyelids, listening to sounds he could not parse into meaning. The Vethkari had arrived 17 months ago. They had not arrived the way humanity had imagined first contact would go, no vast ship splitting the sky, no broadcast on all frequencies, no demand for a representative of Earth's governments. They had simply been there one morning, their settlement already established in the northern wastes of Kepler 442b, exactly as if they had always been there and humanity had simply not been paying attention. Which was, their ambassador had eventually explained, essentially true. They had been watching dust for some time, long enough to build, long enough to decide. Their ships were not ships in any sense Callum could comfortably process. They were structures that seemed to exist in slightly more spatial dimensions than the ones he could perceive, so that looking directly at them gave him the crawling sensation of trying to read a page in a language he almost knew. He had spent 3 months in the survey teams that circled their settlement's perimeter, recording, and in that time he had developed a respect for the Vethkari that was built from equal parts genuine admiration and the specific unease of a man who has realized that he is very much not the most intelligent thing in the room. They communicated in flawless colonial standard, not accented, not hesitant, flawless in the way that a mathematical proof is flawless, every term precisely weighted, every ambiguity resolved before it could arise. It was the fluency of something that had absorbed the entire corpus of a language from the outside, the way a xenobiologist absorbs an organism's physiology, without ever having been a native speaker in any meaningful sense. The words were right, but something underneath them, some harmonic that human speech carried that you didn't notice until it was absent, was not there at all. Callum had flagged this in his report. His supervisor had told him it was a cultural difference and to stop being unsettling in his memos. Now he stood in the Accord Hall, blindfolded, wearing the formal suit that had been delivered to his quarters 3 days ago in a box that left no scent on anything it touched. Around him, based on the acoustics of the space, there were perhaps 40 Vethkari. He could not hear them breathing. He had never been able to hear them breathing. He was not entirely sure they needed to. He could hear, very faintly, the hum of his own subprocessor. It did that when it was working hard. Whatever it was working on, it had started in the moment the blindfold went on and had not stopped since. The administrator had explained the concordance ceremony in the abstract, the way he explained everything that made him uncomfortable, at one remove in the passive voice with the facts scrubbed of their more alarming implications. It was a selection ritual, one of several performed by the Vethkari at certain intervals for certain purposes. The blindfolded participant would move through the space. There would be contact, a touch, possibly several touches. At the end, a selection would be made. Callum had asked, a selection of what? And the administrator had said, a partner in a sense, for an exchange of understanding. It's purely symbolic. He'd been using that word again. Callum began to move. The floor was cold through the soles of his dress shoes. He moved carefully, arms slightly extended, the way you moved through a dark room you hadn't mapped. Around him, the Vethkari were silent and still as geological formations. He could not feel their warmth. They radiated something else, a pressure against his skin that was not temperature and not sound, and not quite anything he had a receptor for. His subprocessor hummed louder. When he had been 11 years old, 2 years post-surgery, his friend Daria had told him he looked at people like he was reading them. He'd said, "Isn't that what you do?" She'd said, "No, we feel people. You read them." He'd thought about that for a long time afterward. He'd never been sure if she meant it as a criticism or a diagnosis. Now, moving blind through a hall full of alien presences that pushed against some peripheral sense he hadn't known he possessed, he thought, maybe reading is enough. Maybe reading is exactly what this is. He stopped. There was someone in front of him. Not a presence he'd walked toward, a presence that had oriented toward him, had turned some center of attention in his direction that he could feel the way you felt a searchlight before it reached you. He stayed very still. Something touched his face. Not his cheek, not his shoulder. His face. A pressure at his temple, then his jaw, then a fingertip, if it was a finger, precisely at the corner of his right eye, where the scar from the surgery had left a 3-centimeter line that was now invisible under skin but perceptible under touch. It rested there. It did not move. The silence in the hall changed, not louder, changed. Then a voice very close said, "You are broken." It was a female voice, speaking colonial standard with that same mathematical precision the Vethkari always used. It did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like notation, like someone recording an observation in a lab journal. "I had surgery," Callum said, "when I was 9. "We know. It is not the surgery we mean. The finger, he was committed to it being a finger, did not move from the scar. Something was removed. Something was not replaced. The replacement is a tool, not a part. You move through the world at a distance from it. We have been watching your species for some years. You are the only one we have observed who does this in this particular way." "Doctors called it effective blunting," Callum said. He kept his voice very level. "I call it being able to think." "We call it," the voice said, "recognizable." The finger withdrew. There was a pause. Then, from across the hall, from several directions at once, which was not how rooms usually worked, a sound rose that Callum could only describe as deliberate. Not music, not speech, but something between the two that had intention the way a mathematical statement had intention. The blindfold was removed. She was standing 18 inches in front of him. He had seen Vethkari before, obviously. He had logged hundreds of observation reports on their physical morphology. He had cataloged their exoskeletal elements, the bioluminescent patterns that shifted along their upper bodies in what the xenobiologists believed was a form of subvocalized communication, the 4 visual organs arranged in a configuration that gave them essentially panoramic perception. He had been professional and thorough, and not unduly disturbed. He had not been prepared for close. She was tall. Not dramatically so, perhaps 20 centimeters over his own height, but the proportion of her was different, limbs slightly elongated, joints articulating in ways that suggested a skeletal structure built for a heavier gravity environment, a neck that held her head at an angle that was just fractionally off from human neutral, and yet communicated, somehow, absolute attention. Her face, the regions of it that corresponded to a face, had gone still in a way that no human face ever went still, and her 4 eyes were regarding him with an expression he had no vocabulary for. Along her collarbone and the ridge of her outer shoulders, the bioluminescence had shifted to a pattern he hadn't seen before, concentrated, slow-moving. His subprocessor hummed with an urgency it usually reserved for hull integrity alerts. "Voss," she said, just his name. "Yes," he said. "We have selected you." She said this without particular ceremony. It was a statement of concluded process. The concordance requires a partner for the period of understanding. You are the partner. He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him from 4 directions simultaneously. "I wasn't told what that involved," he said. "No," she agreed. "Your administrator was not entirely told either. He was told what he would agree to. What the concordance actually involves is more." That was, Callum thought, a disquieting thing to say in the middle of a formal ceremony with 40 of her people as witnesses. He made a note of it in the precise, unpanicking region of his mind that kept notes. "What does it actually involve?" he said. "Understanding," she said. "Extended proximity, exchange. You will learn what we are. We will learn more precisely what you are." Something shifted in the bioluminescence at her shoulder. "There is a word in your language, blindsight, the condition in which vision operates without conscious perception, in which the eye sees but the mind does not know it sees, and yet the body responds correctly to what is seen." "It's a neurological condition," Callum said. "Some people who are blind can still navigate obstacles. Their visual cortex works, but their conscious awareness of it doesn't. Yes, your species has conscious experience. We do not, we process. We respond. We are very fast and very accurate, and we have built civilizations across 47 star systems. But we do not." She paused. The pause was very brief, a fraction of a second, but it was the first imprecision he had heard from a Vethkari in 17 months, and it hit him like a signal anomaly. "From the inside. There is no inside." The hall was completely still. "You're conscious but not self-aware," he said slowly. "No, wait, that's backwards," he thought. His subprocessor hummed. "You're intelligent but not conscious. You process experience, but you don't experience experiencing it." "Yes." The bioluminescence at her shoulders flared briefly, a pattern he had never documented. "That is the precise statement. You are the first human who has arrived at it in one step." "Because most humans couldn't get there without their emotional interference," Callum said. He heard his own voice as if from a slight distance, the way he always did when the thinking moved faster than the talking. They'd get distracted by the philosophical implications, or the fear, or "I had the right hemisphere of my brain removed," the part that does exactly that distraction. "Yes," she said again, "you are broken in exactly the right way." He should have found that offensive. He noted, as from a distance, that he did not. "What do I call you?" he said. She gave him a name in her own language. It was 15 syllables long, and contained 2 frequencies he couldn't produce with a human larynx. She watched him struggle with it and then said, with something that was almost amusement, he read it in the tilt of her head and the particular dimming of the two upper visual organs. You may use a smaller sound. Reach, he said, and then didn't know why he'd said it. She considered this, because we extend toward each other. I didn't mean it symbolically. We know, she said, that is why we accept it. And so it began. The period of understanding lasted, technically, 6 months. In practice, it lasted much longer, in the way that things which change how you think about everything last forever. Callum was given quarters in the interface zone, a cluster of structures built at the border of the human and Vethkari settlements where the architecture was a collaboration, and therefore subtly wrong in ways that were specific to each party. The ceilings too high for humans, the corridors too narrow for Vethkari, everything calibrated to a median that fit neither species perfectly and both species adequately. He ate human food. He slept human hours. He spent 12 hours a day in a series of rooms with Reach, and a rotating cast of Vethkari specialists and human observers who grew progressively more uncomfortable the longer the exchange continued. They were uncomfortable, Callum thought, because something was happening that they hadn't modeled. The concordance in its formal sense was a diplomatic mechanism. The Vethkari wanted a treaty port. The humans wanted technology exchange, or at minimum the assurance of non-aggression from a civilization that had 47 star systems and humanity had approximately 1. The concordance partner was supposed to be a cultural liaison, a bridge, a living symbol of intent. Reach had told him on the 4th day that this was not precisely what the concordance was. They had been sitting in one of the interface rooms, which contained furniture that was a compromise between human chairs and Vethkari perch structures and satisfied neither, and Callum had been reviewing his reports and she had been. He still wasn't entirely sure what she did when she was not actively communicating. Processing, running, computing at speeds that his subprocessor could track the shape of without tracking the content. Your administrator believes this exchange is about trade, she said. I know he does, Callum said. I didn't want to tell him otherwise before I understood otherwise. What is it actually about? Survival, she said. Yours. He put down the report. Okay. We have encountered 41 spacefaring species in the course of our expansion, she said. 38 of them are gone, not destroyed by us. They destroyed themselves or were destroyed by the galaxy or reached the point of technological transcendence and departed into forms of existence we do not have the instruments to track. Of the 3 remaining, 2 are the brief imprecision again, the fractional pause, functional but reduced. 1 is your species. And you've been watching us. Watching is not the correct word. We have been examining your trajectory. There is she searched for a term, and he watched her search for it, which was itself extraordinary, because Vethkari did not search for terms, they produced them, and watching her pause was like watching a stellar calculation hesitate, a pattern in civilizational collapse that we have mapped across the 38. There is a point at which a species becomes intelligent enough to build civilizations and not intelligent enough to not destroy them. Your species is approaching this point. We know, Callum said. We've been approaching it for 400 years. Yes, but you have something the 38 did not. Another pause. The bioluminescence at her shoulder shifted in a pattern he was beginning to read slowly, the way you learn to read a language by immersion without ever having a grammar explained. The pattern meant, I'm attempting to be precise about something imprecise. The 38 were coherent, unified in their modes of cognition. They developed tools and each species used those tools the same way, thought about those tools the same way. Your species does not. You are extraordinarily cognitively diverse. You have, in the same generation, the same century, individuals who think in ways that should be mutually incomprehensible. Artists and engineers. Mystics and empiricists, people who navigate by emotion and people who navigate by data, People whose surgery removed the part that does the distraction. A very small pause. This should be a weakness. It has been a weakness. It is also the reason you are still here. Callum was quiet for a moment. You need to understand how we survive, he said. We need to understand how consciousness, real consciousness, interiority, the experience of experiencing, contributes to adaptation, because we do not have it. We have built 47 systems of civilization without it, and we cannot determine from the outside whether this is ultimately sufficient or whether the 38 who collapsed also lacked it, and this is the variable we have not accounted for. The room was very still. Through the window, which looked over the interface zone toward the red-dusted plains, the sky of Kepler 442b was doing its late afternoon trick of going amber at the top and a dark bruised violet near the horizon, and 3 of the planet's 4 moons were up, and the 4th was a thin sliver just visible at the edge. You're afraid, Callum said. The bioluminescence on her shoulders flared in a complex pattern he had never documented. He found he could read parts of it anyway. We do not experience fear, she said. We have identified a probability distribution in which our civilization collapses, and we do not have sufficient information to navigate away from it. This produces an urgency in our processing. That's fear, Callum said. That's exactly what fear is. She looked at him with her 4 eyes. He looked back. In the strange, fractured light of the alien afternoon, the bioluminescence along her collarbone was a slow tide of something he had started to think of as blue, though it wasn't quite blue. If it is, she said at last, then we have been afraid for a long time. They were not supposed to be friends. The human observers, Dr. Chen, the xenobiologist, and Rafi Akafer from the diplomatic corps, had made this clear in various indirect ways throughout the first month. Friends was not a category the concordance documentation had anticipated. The documentation had anticipated respectful professional exchange, carefully managed mutual comprehension, possibly a historically significant moment of interspecies cooperation. It had not anticipated Callum developing a vocabulary for Reach's bioluminescence. It had not anticipated Reach learning, specifically, to read the microexpressions at the corners of Callum's eyes, the residual tells of a human face from which the more obvious emotional signals had been surgically reduced. It had not anticipated either of them developing, across the 4th and 5th months, the habit of sitting in silence together in the evenings without any formal exchange agenda, because the silence itself had become a form of data. The administrator called Callum in for a review on month 4. The Vethkari delegation has extended the concordance period, Prentice said. I know, Reach told me. She is their queen. Callum looked at him. What? Prentice spread his hands on his desk. We have been using the term ambassador, but that is not accurate. She is their highest executive function. Their decision integrator is the translation the linguistics team settled on. She is, in effect, the administrative center of their civilization's consensus mechanism. He paused. She is, not to put too fine a point on it, the most powerful individual in an interstellar civilization, and she has been spending 12 hours a day in a room with a survey technician. Callum thought about that. Why didn't you tell me before? We weren't certain before, Prentice said. And frankly, we were concerned that if you knew, you would, he gestured vaguely. Act differently. Yes. Callum considered this. You chose me because I wouldn't act differently regardless of who she was. Prentice looked at him for a long moment. Yes, he said, that's why we chose you. He walked back to the interface zone in the late afternoon. The red dust of Kepler 442b got into his shoes and the bottom cuffs of his trousers the way it always did. Above him, the amber sky was going violet at the edges. He passed 3 Vethkari workers who were reconfiguring something at the perimeter, their bodies moving with that inhuman efficiency, no wasted motion, no pauses for thought, every action the output of calculation he couldn't track. And they acknowledged him with a tilt of the head that he had learned, over 4 months, was the Vethkari equivalent of a nod. He found Reach in the usual evening spot, the balcony of the interface building that faced the human settlement, which she said she preferred because it was less visually complex and therefore easier to think near. "You're their queen," he said. She did not turn. The bioluminescence at her shoulders ran through a slow sequence. He read it now well enough to know she had been waiting for this conversation. "We do not use that word." "Decision integrator," he said, "which means every major strategic decision in your civilization flows through your processing." "Yes." "And you came yourself for this?" "Yes." She turned then. Her 4 eyes found him with the particular quality of attention that had taken him the better part of 3 months to understand was not scrutiny. It was something else. The attention of something that was trying to learn precisely how to see. "Why?" he said. "Because the question we are trying to answer," she said, "is too important to delegate." He sat down on the edge of the balcony railing, a habit she had flagged as statistically imprudent on 3 separate occasions, and then stopped flagging, because he always did it anyway, and she had concluded that the behavior was not modifiable by data alone. Below them, the interface zone's lights were coming on in the violet dusk, and further out, the human settlement's grid was a warm orange grid against the dark. "The 38 civilizations," he said. "You've been trying to figure out what killed them." "Trying to determine what will kill us," she said. "We do not need to understand the past. We need to navigate the future." "And you think the answer is consciousness?" "We think consciousness is a variable we do not understand. We are very good at the things we do not understand. We build models. We run iterations, but a model of consciousness built without consciousness." She stopped. The pause was longer than usual. He watched her in the violet light, the slow bioluminescence, the complete stillness. "It is blindsight. We process the signal. We respond correctly sometimes, but we do not see." He was quiet. "And I help with that," he said finally. "You do something unusual," she said. "You are conscious, you experience. But the component of your experience that translates itself into distortion, into the emotions that prevent humans from thinking clearly, has been reduced in you. You are a conscious observer who can report accurately. You are the thing we have been unable to build." "A bridge," he said. "An instrument," she said, and then with the smallest and most precise of pauses, "also a bridge." He smiled. It was not something he did often, not because he was unhappy, but because the circuitry of it ran a little slower than it did in most people, the signal taking a longer route through the architecture of what he was. She had been learning to read it for 5 months, and she caught it now. The slight change at the corner of his eyes, the shift in the muscles around his mouth. Her bioluminescence shifted in the pattern he had come to think of as her equivalent of a smile. He did not know if that was accurate. He had never asked. Some things, he had learned, you understood better by watching than by asking. On the night of the 5th month, they almost broke everything. It happened because of a scrambler. That was what the xenobiologists called the 6-limbed organisms that the Vethkari used. He didn't know if used was right, but no better word had presented itself, as a kind of rapid response biological mechanism. Not pets, not soldiers, something more like antibodies. They were fast beyond anything Callum had encountered, their reaction times operating on a scale that his own enhanced cognition could barely track, and they were deployed in situations requiring speed that conscious decision-making couldn't accommodate. 3 of them had been assigned to Reach as a protective perimeter, running continuous threat assessment, invisible most of the time, appearing occasionally as fast-moving silhouettes at the edge of his peripheral vision. He had been careful around them. He had been very careful, 5 months of careful, reading their patterns in his data and keeping himself predictable and non-threatening. On the 5th month, He did something unpredictable. He was trying to show Reach something. He had been trying for 2 days to explain the concept of a specific kind of human decision-making, the kind that happened in crisis, the kind that ran parallel to and sometimes faster than conscious thought, the kind that produced outcomes that the conscious mind then claimed credit for. It was relevant to the question they were building a model around. What does consciousness add? What does it do that pure processing doesn't? And he had been trying to describe it verbally and not getting it right, because describing cognition from the inside to something that had no inside was like describing color to something with no photoreceptors. So he did a thing. He reached into his jacket pocket, where he kept a small piece of equipment he'd been carrying since his survey days, a pressure trigger multi-tool, the kind that unfolded rapidly when the grip was activated, and he produced it fast, the way he would have if he were actually in a moment requiring fast action, and he held it up to show her the difference between. This is a tool I'm selecting slowly and thoughtfully. And this is the motion of a body that has already decided before the mind has caught up. The scramblers came from nowhere. The first one hit his wrist before he'd processed seeing it move. The second was between him and Reach in a geometry that had no wasted angles. The third was at a position he didn't identify immediately, because it had approached from the side that his surgery had affected, the reduced field side, and it was absolutely still and absolutely ready. He froze. The multi-tool fell to the floor. Reach said one word in Vethkari. It was not a long word. The scramblers retreated. Not slowly, instantly. The threat assessment resolved and the response withdrawn as fast as it had deployed, and the room was just a room again. His wrist ached. His heart was doing something significant. Reach looked at him. You have a heart rate and stress hormone cascade that are unaffected by conscious intention, she said. Yes, he said. He was breathing carefully. You felt fear. Yes. And you continued. He looked at his wrist. Then he looked at her. That's the thing I was trying to show you, he said. The fear happened, and then the decision happened, not instead of the fear, after it, through it. He searched for words, that's what consciousness adds. It doesn't remove the biological responses. It runs alongside them, it says. I am afraid and I am going to do this anyway, and the anyway is the part that's new. The room was very still. We do not have anyway, she said. No, you just have response. Extremely accurate response, very fast, very optimized, but no anyway. The bioluminescence at her shoulders was doing something he had never documented. He was going to run out of words for new patterns soon. The 38, he said. When they collapsed, they encountered situations for which their processing had no optimized response, she said. Novel situations, situations without precedent. Their processing defaulted to prior response frameworks, and the mismatch between framework and situation produced cascade failures. And you encountered the same thing. On multiple occasions, we adapted, we built better models. But at the fractional pause, the honest imprecision, we are aware that we are building models of situations we have not yet encountered, and we do not know what we cannot model. But we do something with what we can't model, Callum said. We don't always do it well. We panic, we overreact, we make catastrophically bad decisions based on fear that ran ahead of thinking. But sometimes we build the decision through the panic. We use the fear as data, and we build the anyway on top of it. She was very still. This is what you wanted to know, he said. This is what we needed to know, she said. Whether it could be modeled, whether we could learn to, another pause longer, whether we could learn to anyway. He picked the multi-tool off the floor. He folded it slowly and put it back in his pocket. Can you, he said. The bioluminescence ran through a sequence he had never seen. Slow, complex, something that moved through colors he hadn't documented. We do not know, she said. We have never tried. We have never believed it was possible to build a model of something we fundamentally lack, but—" She stopped, started again. "We have been watching you for 5 months, and something in our processing has begun to change, to include variables it did not previously include. When we run the threat response calculation for your presence in this room, the output includes a category that was not in the prior model." "What category?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, then precisely, loss. He looked at her for a long time. The 6th month of the concordance was different. Something had shifted in the exchange, not in its form, which remained the same long sessions of structured dialogue and documented observation, but in its quality. Reach asked different questions. They were harder questions, less precisely formulated, questions that groped toward something rather than naming it. She asked him about grief. She asked him about joy in the specific sense of joy without reason, the human capacity for positive affect that had no clear adaptive function. She asked him once about the strange dual experience of watching yourself act from inside the action, knowing you are afraid, knowing you are choosing, experiencing both simultaneously. He answered as honestly as he could. He told her that his answers were unreliable because his surgery had changed the architecture of how he experienced things, and he couldn't be certain his reports were representative. She said, "That is exactly why we asked you. You can describe the structure without the noise. You are the clearest signal we have found." He thought about that. He thought about being 9 years old and being told he was different now. He thought about his friend Darius saying, "You read people, you don't feel them." He thought about his father saying, "You're still you. You're just more." He was thinking about this on the evening of the last formal day of the concordance, when Reach appeared on the balcony where he was sitting, and did something he had never seen a Vethkari do. She sat down next to him. Not across from him, not at the appropriate professional distance. Next to him, close enough that he could feel the pressure of the non-temperature she radiated, the field that wasn't heat and wasn't cold and had taken him 2 months to stop flinching away from. She sat down next to him, and she looked at the orange grid of the human settlement in the violet dark, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We have to go." He had known this was coming. He'd known it for 3 weeks, reading it in the increased operational tempo of the Vethkari settlement, the changed flight patterns of the small navigation drones they used for internal communication, the particular quality of distance that had started appearing in Reach's processing pauses. Something had been decided, something large. "Where," he said. "There is a situation in the reach of the 17th arm," she said, which was the Vethkari term for a sector of space approximately 400 light-years distant. It requires the decision integrator's presence. "A crisis. A novel situation," she said, "one for which our prior response frameworks are insufficient." He was quiet for a moment. The violet dark above them was filling with stars, which on Kepler 442b came out fast, a field of them in minutes rather than hours because the atmosphere was thinner than Earth's and the sky didn't hold the light as long. "Are you afraid?" he said. The bioluminescence at her shoulders ran through the sequence he had never documented, slowly, completely. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him with all 4 eyes, with the quality of attention he had spent 6 months learning to read. The attention of something that was trying to learn to see. The attention of something that had begun to build a category called loss. "You're going to be okay," he said. "You cannot know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I can't." He held her gaze all 4 points of it without looking away. "I believe it anyway." The bioluminescence at her shoulders flared once, brilliantly, in a pattern he had never documented and would spend the rest of his life trying to describe, before it faded back to its slow tide. She reached out, and it was the same hand, the same presumed finger, the same precision, and placed it at the corner of his right eye, at the scar, right there where the surgery had begun and ended and changed him into whatever he was now. She rested it there for 3 seconds, which was a long time for a Vethkari and a long time for him. Then she withdrew. "There is a Vethkari word," she said. "It does not translate precisely. It means the state of having been changed by a process of understanding in a direction that cannot be reversed." He waited. "You will not have a word for what we are to each other," she said. "We do not have one either now, but we thought you should know that we have named the state." "What's the word?" he said. She said it. 15 syllables, 2 frequencies he couldn't produce. He tried and got 4 syllables and approximately 1 frequency. She heard it, and the bioluminescence shifted in the pattern he had learned to read as amusement. "That means something else in our language," she said. "Does it mean something good?" "It means," she said, "a thing that extends toward you." He laughed. He did not often laugh, but he laughed then, in the dark on the balcony of the building where 2 species had tried to learn to see each other, with the orange lights of the human settlement below and the alien stars coming out above, and the red dust of Kepler 442b in the creases of his hands as always. She was still for a moment, processing the laugh, and then he was sure he saw, her upper visual organs perform the fractional dimming that he had never definitively decoded, but had always thought was the closest she had to something that happened in the chest rather than in the processing centers. Maybe he was wrong. He had always been careful about maybe. But he chose to believe it anyway. The Vethkari left 3 days later. Their structures compressed or collapsed or withdrew into dimensions he could not fully perceive, and the northern waste was simply empty of them, and then simply the northern waste. He spent a long time on the balcony. Then he went to his desk and wrote a report. It was the most unusual report he had ever written, and he had written some unusual ones. He wrote about consciousness as an adaptive mechanism. He wrote about the anyway, the human capacity to run a decision through fear instead of around it, to use the biological response as information rather than override. He wrote about what a civilization without interiority might gain from understanding interiority, and what a half-conscious man with a subprocessor and a surgical scar had gained from understanding a species that thought at speeds he would never reach and experienced nothing from the inside. He did not write about the finger at the corner of his eye. Some things were data, and some things were not, and this was one of the ones that was not, and he had learned enough in 6 months about the structure of experience to know that the things that weren't data were sometimes the things that mattered most. Administrator Prentice read the report and said it was unprecedented and asked if Callum thought the Vethkari would return. Callum thought about that. "Yes," he said. "How do you know?" He thought about a word in 15 syllables and 2 impossible frequencies. He thought about a civilization that had just discovered it had a category called loss. He thought about the last thing she had said, standing at the edge of the balcony looking out at the alien dark. "You will not be alone in this," she had said. "We will send you the maps of the 38, what they built, what failed, where the cascade points are. This is what we have to give." And he had said, "And I'll be here." And she had said, "We know." "She told me," he said to the administrator. And then, because he had been doing this for years and he was very good at it, "The important thing is the maps of the 38. Start a team on it. Get the xenomathematicians and the historians and the systems theorists. It's going to take years." "And what will you be doing?" Prentice asked. Callum looked out the window at the red dust of Kepler 442b, and the violet sky going amber at the top, and the 4 moons catching the light of an orange sun. "Reading," he said. "I'm very good at reading." He meant it the way Daria had always meant it, as a diagnosis, not a criticism, as a thing he was, specifically, built to do, as the thing that had made him, in the end, the right kind of broken. The subprocessor behind his right ear hummed quietly. the way it always did when it was working on something large and important. He thought it might hum like that for a very long time. He thought that was all right.